Welcome back to the Code Wolf. In today's video, we're going to take a look at how to use the Azure Cosmos DB emulator to develop with this service locally. This can be a great option in situations where you might not have permissions to create this service in Azure, or you're trying to remove the number of external dependencies in your local development workflow, or even potentially save on costs depending on some scenarios. Let's see how this works. Please remember to click subscribe or the like button to support this video if you like the content. Alright, so at the moment I have a really simple app set up that already connects to Azure Cosmos DB out in Azure using a real service. I'm not really going to cover how to develop against Cosmos DB in general in this video. This is more just about how to use the local emulator, so I'm assuming you have at least some really basic working knowledge of this service. So with this code, we create our Cosmos client, and this is the main service that talks to our Cosmos instance out in Azure. And then we run the create database if not exists method, and that will either create the database or return it in our variable here if it already exists. And then we go out and get our container. I'm using the NoSQL API for this example. And since Cosmos is pretty loosely structured, we can just create a new item. And then we run an upsert item async, which will basically update the item if it already exists, or add it as a new one if it doesn't exist. So this is pretty simple. Even if you haven't worked with Cosmos, you should be able to follow along with the general concepts here. Now, the key concepts for our purposes are these two values here. So we have our account endpoint, and that's where we actually go out and talk to our service. So you can see that's a URL here out in Azure. And then we have our key. So this is what we're using to authenticate to that service. So if I were to just run this app, so if I say .NET run and give that a second to think, you can see it logs created. So down here, it does a console write line on the response back from Cosmos. So it created a new instance of our item, and I'm using some random values here to make sure we can keep creating new ones. So if we go out to our Azure account, we can see in our Data Explorer, if you click on the left on your Cosmos account menu here, the Data Explorer, then we have this database called Wolf Shop. And so this is just kind of mimicking a simple store, and we have a products container here. So when I click on items and refresh this, there's currently 3 items with different IDs. So we do have some data in here just for demonstration purposes. But again, this all lives out on a real Azure service, and maybe you don't have permissions to create a real service, or you don't want to deal with an external dependency like this. You want to keep everything local on your computer, just like you would with a local database or something like that. Well, you can do that in Cosmos using the local emulator. So if we go out to the download page for that, and I'll include this link in the description below, but if you just run a Google search for the Azure Cosmos DB emulator, you'll probably end up on this page in one of the top results. And at the moment, the NoSQL and MongoDB APIs are the best supported. These other 3 don't have much to offer with the emulator at the time of this recording, but I would imagine these first 2 are the most common. So we're going to go with NoSQL for this video like we saw in our code. So if we scroll down here, there's some simple prereqs for .NET 6 or later, or Python or Node versions, depending on what you're using. I'm using .NET 8 in this video. And if you choose the container approach, you do have to have Docker Desktop installed. We'll look at that container workflow in a moment, but for now, let's start with the local install. You can check the timestamps below if you want to jump to that. So you can just click this download link, and that's going to launch a download. And then you can run the MSI installer here, and it's a pretty standard install. So I already have this installed. And when you finish the installation, it will launch a Data Explorer page. But if that doesn't launch, you can also get that down in your system tray here. So you can just click on this Cosmos emulator icon and open the Data Explorer. And here we can see it says, congratulations, your Azure Cosmos DB emulator is running. And it gives us some connection information to get set up with that, just like we did with our service out in Azure. So we get our URI for our local host address. So first let's copy that and switch back to our program here. So I'll paste that in over our real value. Looks like that didn't take. So I'll copy this again and paste this over. And then let's grab our primary key. So I'll copy that and I'll paste that over the real key in our Azure Cosmos account. As a warning, when you're working with real keys, make sure that you keep those safe and don't send those to anyone who shouldn't have access. Those keys have pretty global super admin type permissions, so just be careful there. But for this local emulator, it's not as big of a deal. It's just on our local system with test data. So believe it or not, that's actually all we have to do to switch over to our local emulator once that's running. So if I were to save this, and if I were to say .NET Run again, this should just work as is. There's no additional configurations or code we have to run. It still says created. So when we come back here, we also have a data explorer in our local emulator. So if I were to go into this Wolf Shop store again and look at our products container, I've already been testing with this, but if we look at these IDs, you can see that we do indeed have our items here. We have some sample data that was inserted. And just to prove that this actually is working, we could run this one more time, and that's going to add a fourth item in there. So right now we have 3, and if we refresh this, you can see our 4th one pops in. So it's really that easy to work with the Azure Cosmos emulator. Now, if you read the documentation, you can tweak some of these values when you start them up, especially if you're using the containerized version. It's pretty easy to just pass in some parameters there. So I encourage you to kind of read through this if you want that kind of custom control. But for 90% of use cases, it's going to be just fine to use your local host address with the default primary key. Now, if you do want to use the container workflow for this, I'm just going to show a really basic workflow for how to get that set up. You will need Docker Desktop installed and running. I'm not really going to get into how to set this up. It's a pretty standard install if you just Google search for Docker Desktop. So just make sure you have this installed and running. And once that's ready to go, we can use this Docker pull command and point that to the latest image of the Microsoft Cosmos DB /Linux emulator. So we're going to want to pull down this image. So I'll hit enter to run that. And I've already pulled this image, so it's just going to tell me that I already have the latest. But if you haven't pulled it, it'll download that for you. And then you can run Docker images to make sure that was pulled down. Or you can also check that in Docker Desktop here. Now to run this, we can just do Docker run. And you can pass in whatever parameters you want here. So you could do interactive, things like that. But I'm just going to keep this as simple as possible. So I'm just going to run this image directly again. And it does give us this notification that this is an evaluation version and that there's X number of days left. Based on what I've researched online, this isn't a real warning, or this is sort of a bug or inaccurate display message. You can research that yourself, but I'm just going to let this run and start up. And once those are all ready to go, we'll be able to access our Data Explorer in the browser. So once that's running, we can access this out in the browser using the default URL. So that's going to be localhost 8081 as the port, and then it's /explorer/index.html. So this will give us the Data Explorer page, and this is the same page that you'll get if you just did a local install. So to wrap things up, there's a couple other items I wanted to point out. If you read through the documentation, you will find that there are some differences between the emulator and the cloud service. So for example, the emulator only supports provisioned throughput and not a serverless setup. And then there's some differences with the consistency levels and things like that. So for general usage, you should be fine. But if you're looking for really fine-tune requests or performance monitoring and specific features, there might be times where you want to switch back to a real Azure Cosmos DB service to test those things. And just as a reminder, there's also different ways to run these containers. So if you go to the documentation, there's different parameters, and you can change the default configurations, and you can use different keys or a connection string and such to connect. So there are options here to configure, how you're running this emulator and what the specific connections are. So I recommend reading through these if you really want to get into the details. But for just general development, it's really easy to just start up a container or the local install and start working with the NoSQL and MongoDB APIs. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Please hit subscribe or like to support the channel, and I'll see you next time.